In December 2022, the Prime Minister announced that the government would be redoubling its efforts on enforcement activity around illegal working and announced an intention to increase illegal working enforcement action by 50%. Now, with that in mind, employers are understandably going to be thinking about their right to work policies and what they're doing to check that their employees are not working in the UK without the correct immigration permissions. And we have seen in the beginning of this year an actual increase in the amount of enforcement activity and the number of enforcement visits the Home Office is undertaking. So with that in mind, Ruth, companies are obviously going to be thinking about their own right to work policies and what they need to be doing to ensure that their workers are working in the UK legally. What are the key considerations and what kind of things do you see when you're advising clients in terms of bad practices and good practices?
Okay, so I think one key thing that we're still seeing is confusion over what should be done in terms of EU nationals. So obviously, as I'm sure we're all aware, the UK left the EU at the end of 2020. There was a transition period until July 2021, at which time it became no longer acceptable to simply accept an EU passport to show that someone has the right to work in the UK. So instead, EU nationals now, like nationals of any other country that aren't British or Irish, have to show that they have immigration status in the UK. So we are still seeing quite a few employers that are accepting these EU passports, which obviously now is no longer compliant with the Home Office's guide.
What about nationals of other countries then, non-EU or EEA countries? What sort of issues are you seeing with right to work checks for them?
So again, there's been quite a big change to how right to work checks are done for these individuals too. So in April of 2022, there was a change that meant anybody who holds a number of documents, so for example, a biometric residence permit, frontier worker permit, status under the EU settlement scheme. So for all of these individuals now, what the employer has to do is an online right to work check. So this is the check where they provide a share code and you put that into the Home Office's site, and then that shows you a profile page with the details of that person's right to work. So what you can't do anymore is take a copy of somebody's biometric residence permit, for example. And again, this is something that we're still seeing some employers doing because obviously that's been the practice for such a long time. But yeah, like I said, so since April 2022, that's no longer acceptable.
Okay, and let's say an employer does receive an enforcement notice or enforcement visit from the Home Office. How do they actually prove to the Home Office that they have done the correct right to work check and that they've done it at the right time?
So for a compliant right to work check, we have to do the actual check, but you also have to maintain a record of that check. For example, if it's an online check, it's taking a record of the online profile page. If it's a check on a physical document, it's making sure that you take a copy of that document. What you also have to do, and one of the biggest issues I think we see when we're looking at right to work checks, is you have to record the date on which that check actually took place. That's important because for it to be a compliant check, it must have been done before that person actually starts work. So you need to be able to demonstrate that that's the case. A lot of times we see, mainly on physical document checks, people simply writing the date on the copy. That in itself, unfortunately, isn't compliant. There's certain wording that the Home Office recommends of what you should be using. So if you take a copy of a physical document, you can write on that the date on which this right to work check took place was, and then provide the date. Alternatively, you could always keep a central record of the right to work checks you carry out on the dates at which they take place. But yeah, that's certainly one of the biggest issues we see. Despite people taking copies and doing the checks, if the date's not on there properly, it's still not a compliant check.
Okay, what about students? Because we often get queries from employers regarding what evidence they need for right to work for international students. Are there any special considerations there?
Yeah, so this is a slightly more complex right to work check, and this is because most people who are in the UK as a sponsored student, so with a student visa, they have different conditions on their work than other people may have. So usually what we'll have is students allowed to work for a certain amount of hours during term time. This is usually 20 hours, sometimes 10. And then full-time hours outside of term time, so in vacation periods, in the period before the course actually starts and for a bit of time after the course ends. So the importance here is knowing when is term time and when isn't. So on top of doing the check, so now it's looking at doing an online check, you also need to have evidence from the university which confirms when the term times are, so that you can be sure that you're keeping with the conditions of only working those certain amount of hours within those times.
So when companies are thinking about their right to work policies going forwards then, Ruth, do they need to be thinking about doing checks on all employees, or is it just certain categories of employees?
No, so right to work checks have to be carried out on all employees. And again, this is something we see some confusion with. If somebody knows somebody to be a British citizen or presumes them to be, sometimes they think it's not necessary to do the check, but that's not correct. You know, it has to be done on everybody, because only then can you actually confirm that that person has the right to work, and also it avoids any discrimination as well. If you'd like any further information on the points that we've discussed, please feel free to contact myself or Shabana on the contact details that you can see on your screen, or you can find our details on the Walker Morris website.